Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Von Manor, where we're talking about Star Trek today. Yes, we're going to be talking about Star Trek. One of my favorite television shows of all time, Star Trek. Now, Star Trek was already off the air when I was born. I was born in 1971. And so when I was a kid, Star Trek was already on syndication on television, which is where Star Trek actually became popular. And so for me, Star Trek has always existed. When I was a little toddler, Star Trek was on television because my mom was a big Star Trek fan. So every time Star Trek was showing, my mom had it on TV. And so yeah, for me, Star Trek has always existed. I can't remember the first time I saw it because I was too little. And I loved Star Trek growing up because it's a fantastic show. Star Trek is great, and I like all the original Star Trek series up through Enterprise, at least. However, if you got rid of every Star Trek series that exists except for the original series, Star Trek would still be just as important as it is because Star Trek the original series had everything in it that is important about Star Trek. The original series was fantastic with Captain Kirk, Mr. Spock, Uhura, Dr. McCoy, all of those great characters, and those fantastic original science fiction stories that were on the original show. Wonderful show. And I wanted to talk today about Star Trek. It is Book Trek 2022, a reading event created by Revenant Reads, and I haven't talked much about Star Trek yet for Book Trek, so here I go talking about it. And I thought I would start with James Blish because James Blish was the very beginning of Star Trek fiction. James Blish, who was a well-respected science fiction author. He had written Cities in Flight, and he won a Hugo Award for A Case of Conscience. And I think he will probably be, that's probably what he is remembered the most for, is probably A Case of Conscience. And that's probably what he will be remembered for over time. But where he made his money, oddly enough, was by writing Star Trek books. He wrote a series of Star Trek books, most of which were adaptations of episodes, although he did write one original novel. And it was an interesting series of books. He was offered this job to write Star Trek books, and he nearly didn't take it because he thought writing novelizations was hack work, something a well-respected writer wouldn't do. He had that idea, and he thought it would be bad for his reputation, actually, if he were to write novelizations of television episodes. The first book was written when Star Trek was still on the air, and it wasn't nearly as popular, of course, as it became later. It was just a television show. A good television show that I think was pretty respected by people who liked science fiction. But still, it wasn't close to being what it became. And James Blish would have no idea at the time that Star Trek would become what it would become. But he accepted the job, even though he had reservations. Probably because, you know, they offered him $2,000 to do it. So he did it. And he used his own name. He was considering using a pseudonym, but he used his own name to write these books. Altogether, there were 12 Star Trek books in the line of adaptions. Can I say that word, adaptions? And he also wrote, like I said, one original novel, Spock Must Die. So let's go over this series of books and why it is so interesting. I do want to point out that a couple days ago, J. Scott Phillips, the booktuber J. Scott Phillips, who is incredible, came out with a video about the artwork that graces the covers of these books. And it's a fantastic video. So I'm going to link that video down below because it was awesome. I had thought of doing this video before I saw that video, and I almost didn't do this after that, but he focused on the artwork, so I'm going to focus on the rest of the stuff about the James Blish books. And let's go over them. Let's start off with the very first one, which was this one. This is not the original printing of the first book, but this is the first book. Star Trek, which later was retitled Star Trek 1, because all the other Star Trek books had numbers on them. But it was just Star Trek. A chilling journey through worlds beyond imagination. Adapted by James Blish. Now you'll notice that the cover is completely awesome. I learned on that J. Scott Phillips video that this is by James Bama who did this. And I had always wondered why this original cover was so great and the next two that came after it were just pictures from the show, photographs from the show. And it turns out that this illustration by James Bama wasn't originally done for this book. It was a piece of promotional art for the television show that was reused for this book, which explains why it's so good and the next couple covers are not. But this is a beautiful piece of artwork for the original television show Star Trek. So this is the very first book, and it has 6 episodes in it. 7 episodes. It has 7 episodes in it. And it has some there's some interesting things about this. And you can see it when you read the back. Science officer Spock, inheriting a precise logical thinking pattern from his father, a native of the planet Vulcanus. So, you know, in this early book, they didn't even get the planet Vulcan right. And there are reasons for that. And if you read this book, there are some interesting things that pop out at you that don't really go along with what we know about a lot of things in Star Trek. And that is because James Blish, when he wrote this, had never seen an episode of Star Trek. He was working off of scripts that were sent to him from the producers of Star Trek. And so he had never seen an episode, so he was working purely from the scripts, which often changed by the time the episodes were filmed. You will see that in some of the titles of the episodes. Like the very first story in this is Charlie's Law, which was filmed as Charlie X, I believe, or on the episode it's Charlie X. And there's some interesting things about the novelized episodes in here. First of all, like I said, every episode is novelized as a short story. And so you have 7 short stories based on episodes. One of these, for example, was the very famous episode Balance of Terror. But there's a big difference with the episode as it's novelized than as it was aired. There's a lot of stuff about the Romulans in the episode that does not appear at all in the story in this book. And I don't know if that was because all of that stuff was added later to the script and James Blish had an earlier version of that script. So if you watch that episode Balance of Terror, Captain Kirk and a Romulan commander are kind of doing this cat and mouse space battle. The Romulans have a cloaking device. And you see things from both sides. You see things from Captain Kirk's side on the Enterprise, and you see things from the Romulan side on the Romulan ship. But the way it is in here, you only see Kirk's side of things for the most part. It's interesting. It's good. It's entertaining. All of these are entertaining. But you see a lot of differences in here from the actual television show, the way they were aired. And that's kind of interesting. Now that changes a little bit over time as far as how the characters are presented. They're presented more in line with how they're presented on the television show. But you always see some differences between the scripts as they were filmed and as they were adapted by James Blish. Now I should mention that the first time I read these I was a little kid, and I read them at the library, the San Leandro Library, in a very different format. I read them in the Star Trek Reader format, which was book club editions that reprinted this original series. And I'll show a little bit more of these later. But I just have such great memories of sitting around the San Leandro Library reading these hardcover editions of these stories from the Star Trek television show. And they were short enough that if I went to the library with my mom, I could have time to just sit there and read one story every time I showed up at the library, which is what I did. It was great. But anyway, this was the first Star Trek book. It was a success. So they came out with a second one. And this is what I'm talking about as far as the cover is concerned. You see, the second one is just a picture of Kirk and Spock kind of hanging out. But there was nothing spectacular about the artwork. It was just as simple could be. Same thing with the third one. Star Trek 3, only we get Uhura on the cover as well. Now, all of these three books were printed while Star Trek was still on the air. They were basically to help sell the show. But they ended up selling very well in themselves, these books. They were hits, actually. And so when the show went off the air, an unusual thing happened in that they continued to print Star Trek books, which didn't happen a lot, you know, where there was a show that wasn't on television, but they would still do tie-in books about that show. Usually once the show was off the air, it was dead. No one was going to waste a lot of time printing books about it. But these books were really selling, and Star Trek had a loyal fan base who would buy these books. So they continued to make these books. And I think it was after the third Star Trek book that James Blish wrote his original novel, Spock Must Die, which I don't have a physical copy of by itself. Spock Must Die by James Blish. This was the first original Star Trek novel that was printed. So it's kind of historic in itself, Spock Must Die. And it's not terrible. It's okay. There are some things in this book that have not aged well, but you know, as a piece of Star Trek history, it's kind of important. And it was the very first Star Trek novel. And it was actually better than a lot of the other early Star Trek novels. A lot of the early Star Trek novels were not so great, let me tell you. But Spock Must Die, this was the first. And James Blish was kind of ambivalent about it. He didn't take it particularly seriously, but it was $3,000, I think, that he got for this book. So he wrote it. Now after that, he just continued on with the regular series of adaptations, which I'll just throw up here so you could take a look at them. And at some point, as these books were coming out, and these like 4, 5, and the rest all came out after the show was already off the air, but were still selling like crazy. But at some point after Star Trek V, he started getting assistance from his wife, J.A. Lawrence, to write this series of books. But she never got credit. And I've heard different accounts of when she started helping him write these. For example, this is a great cover, by the way. For example, after this book, there are stories that J.A. Lawrence wrote everything. Like, she just wrote every book after this, and James Blish didn't write anything. I don't know if that was true or not. I actually don't know exactly at one point J.A. Lawrence started helping him write the scripts, but at some point she did. But she did not get credit. So it's sort of hard to know where exactly J.A. Lawrence started assisting James Blish with these scripts, or exactly how much she wrote. But it's pretty clear that she did write some of it. if not a lot or most of it. I mean, who knows? But somewhere after Star Trek 6, apparently J.A. Lawrence, James Blish's wife, helped write the episodes, and they're still excellent. They're excellent adaptations. They're excellent stories, very well written. So, you know, she did a job as well. She did as good a job as James Blish was doing. This is Star Trek 7. That's a pretty cool cover. I like that one. Star Trek 8. That's a very excellent one where you have this guy on this planet with a helmet, which they never wore on Star Trek. There were odd things about the covers of these. They looked like Star Trek, but they were a little different. They were an alternate version of Star Trek, but they looked really, really cool. So you'd have stuff like this guy who kind of looks like he's from Star Trek, but, you know, kind of not with that helmet. And then after that, you just get shots of the Enterprise floating around out in space. This is Star Trek 9. Star Trek 10. I actually like this cover. Star Trek 10. And then it went all the way up to Star Trek 11. And I don't have a copy of Star Trek 12. But here it is as it first arrived, Star Trek 12. And as was pointed out by J. Scott Phillips, this is not a great cover. The Enterprise looks a little odd. It looks okay if you only look at it from like a side view, maybe in your peripheral vision. But if you look dead on, no, that's not a great image of the Enterprise. So this was the very last book in the series. It did get another cover that is a wee bit better, I guess. And all of these books were reprinted later with different covers. None of them were as good as the original covers. And then there was a final book, Mudd's Angels. James Blish wanted to save the episodes with Mudd in them, Harry Mudd, who was a popular character in Star Trek. He actually showed up more than once. And so we have the adaptions from the Star Trek show with Mudd and an original story by J.A. Lawrence. Apparently she wrote that whole thing. So J.A. Lawrence gets credit on Mudd's Angels. So this is kind of, Mudd's Angels is kind of part of the series and sort of not, because it's not numbered along with the rest of the series. But that pretty much completed this original run of Star Trek books. And then there was a whole series of Star Trek novels that just never ended. They just kept going on, and they're still going on. Probably the best or most fancy pants edition is this one. Although I will show you the Star Trek readers before I go, because this is how I originally read these in the Star Trek readers. There was an annoying thing about these in that they didn't reprint in the Star Trek readers the books as they were published. So this has Star Trek 2, 3, and 8. But it doesn't matter really, because they're just, you know, novelized episodes. And so they just reprinted the paperback covers in hardback. This is really cool. All these guys are beaming down. Again, it looks like Star Trek, but it doesn't really look like Star Trek. It looks like an odd alternate reality version of Star Trek. We don't really recognize any of these folks. And this last one also had Spock Must Die in it. This is Star Trek 4, kind of a beat-up cover, but, you know, these books are old. But this was reprinted. This is a reprint of the James Blish, J.A. Lawrence stories in hardcover, fancy pants hardcover from Barnes & Noble. Star Trek, the classic episodes. Now, it doesn't have James Blish's name anywhere on here. Nice end papers there. But that is what these are. It does have a little note in here. A note on the text, which tells you, oh yeah, these were all adapted by James Blish and J.A. Lawrence. And this doesn't have all of the adaptions, but it has quite a few of them. And this is probably the fanciest version you can get. They were reprinted at one time in thick paperback books that just did one season at a time, but I don't have any of those. But these James Blish books, starting with this first one, are very well remembered. And they were important because they kicked off the Star Trek series of books, which, like I say, just never ended. James Blish, like I said, was kind of ambivalent about the whole thing. I think maybe it bothered him, perhaps, that this is where he made all his money, or this is what gave him financial security and not his own original work. But I believe it is his original work that ultimately he will be remembered for, but this was pretty cool too. Okay, I'll shut up because I've gone on at length. I will catch you next time.